The alarm didn't sound. It screamed. Not the standard facility alert tone, not the calm synthetic chime designed to keep personnel rational under pressure, but a raw, distorted wail that cut through the bones of the station like something alive was dying inside the walls. Red emergency strobes flooded the corridor in rhythmic pulses, painting everything in fractured shadows. The containment wing of Orbital Xenobiology Station K7 had gone into full lockdown without authorization. And at the center of it all stood Evan Cole. He didn't move. Not because he wasn't trained to respond, but because nothing in his training had ever included this. Behind the reinforced observation glass, something small scraped the inside of the nursery chamber. The sound wasn't loud. That made it worse. It was precise. Deliberate. Like claws dragging across molten glass that somehow refused to break. Evan stepped closer despite the warning lights flashing across his retinal HUD. "Tell me again," he said slowly, voice tight, controlled, "why the human is babysitting dragon hatchlings." The word dragon still felt wrong in his mouth. Captain Rourke stood behind him, arms crossed, face unreadable under the red glow. "Because every trained Drake mind handler quit after the last incident." "That's not an answer," Evan said. "It's the only one you're getting." A deeper crack echoed from inside the chamber. Not glass breaking. Something testing limits. Evan turned slightly. "Define incident." Rourke hesitated for half a second too long. That was enough. Inside the chamber, three shapes shifted in the dim heat-lit fog. Small. Barely the size of Terran wolves. Their scales were not fully formed, molten gold and ember-red plates still fusing like living metal. They were supposed to be dormant for another 48 hours. They were not dormant. One of them lifted its head. And looked directly at Evan. Not past him. Not through him. At him. Evan felt something cold crawl up his spine. "That one," he muttered, pointing slightly. "It's tracking me." Dylan Marsh, xenobiology technician, arrived at a jog, sliding to a stop beside them. His breath came fast, eyes locked on the chamber reading streaming across his wrist pad. "That's impossible," Dylan said immediately. "Yeah," Evan replied, not looking away from the hatchlings. "I'm starting to notice that theme." Dylan swallowed, then tapped his screen again. Neural imprinting sensors are spiking. Way above baseline. "Meaning?" Rourke asked sharply. Dylan's face tightened. "Meaning they're not behaving like presentient drakes." Another scrape sounded inside the chamber. Then another. The second hatchling moved. And mirrored the first. "Exactly." Evan narrowed his eyes. "That's mimicry." "No," Dylan said, voice lowering. "That's synchronization." The third hatchling shifted slightly later than the others, but when it did, it copied not just the movement, but the timing delay. Evan felt his stomach tighten. "They're learning from each other," he said. Dylan shook his head. "Not just learning. Calibrating." Captain Rourke stepped closer to the glass. "They're animals. Newly hatched. They don't have the neural architecture for." A sharp pulse of light erupted inside the chamber. All three hatchlings froze. Then, slowly, in perfect sequence, they turned toward the glass wall. Toward Rourke. Toward Evan. Toward Dylan. The room went quiet in a way that felt unnatural. Even the alarm tone seemed to distort, like the station itself was hesitating. Evan took a step back. "That's not instinct," he whispered. Dylan didn't answer. Because his eyes were locked on the telemetry feed, and every line of data was rewriting itself in real time. "Captain," Dylan said slowly, "they're not reacting to stimuli." Rourke frowned. "Explain." Dylan's fingers trembled over the console. "They're predicting it." A beat of silence. Then another crack sounded inside the chamber. But this one was different. It wasn't testing glass anymore. It was tapping. Rhythmic. Intentional. Evan leaned closer despite every survival instinct screaming at him not to. The smallest hatchling pressed its claw against the inner surface of the glass. And tapped once. Then twice. Then paused. Evan felt something shift in the room. Because the rhythm wasn't random. It was structured. Mathematical. Dylan's voice dropped to a whisper. That's communication protocol sequencing." Rourke snapped his head toward him. "They can't possibly have a communication system." Dylan looked up, pale. "Then explain why they just stopped the alarm feed from interfering with their pattern recognition." Evan felt his throat go dry. Inside the chamber, all three hatchlings moved closer to the glass in unison. And for the first time, they didn't look like animals. They looked like something trying to understand a locked door. And realizing, with growing certainty, that the lock was already inside the room with them. The chamber lights dimmed automatically as the system attempted to compensate for rising internal thermal output. It didn't help. Inside nursery pod K7, the air shimmered like a mirage over burning metal. Evan kept his eyes locked on the hatchlings. They hadn't moved since the tapping stopped. That silence was worse than any noise. Dylan Marsh burst into the control bay moments later, nearly slipping on the polished floor as he skidded toward the diagnostic console. I reran the neural scans, Dylan said breathlessly, fingers flying across the interface. I triple-checked the sensor calibration. Rourke didn't look at him. And? Dylan hesitated. That hesitation said everything. They're wrong, he said finally. Evan turned slightly. Wrong how? Dylan swallowed. The baseline assumption is wrong. We classified them as instinct-driven Drake hatchlings with rudimentary pre-language cognition. Rourke frowned. That's what they are. No, Dylan said quietly. That's what they should be. The chamber responded to his voice. Not physically, but perceptually. All three hatchlings turned their heads at the exact same moment. Evan felt it again, that subtle, crawling awareness that they were being observed and adjusting for it. Dylan backed up a step. Look at the heat signatures. Evan glanced at the display. At first, it looked normal, 3 small thermal blooms clustered together near the chamber center. Then the pattern shifted. Not randomly. Not chaotically. Synchronously. They're sharing thermal output, Dylan said, voice tightening. That shouldn't be possible. Individual metabolism rates don't. He stopped mid-sentence. Because the heat signatures had started to pulse. In rhythm. Like a heartbeat. But there were 3 bodies. And 1 rhythm. Rourke crossed his arms tightly. Maybe it's a shared environmental response. Dylan shook his head sharply. No. Look at the delay variance. He zoomed in. The pulses weren't identical. They were sequenced. Each hatchling waited a fraction of a second before repeating the same thermal fluctuation. Evan felt his stomach tighten again. They're taking turns. Dylan nodded slowly. Yes. Like they're running a distributed process. Rourke gave him a hard look. You're saying they're computing. I'm saying, Dylan corrected carefully, they're dividing cognition. A heavy silence fell. Inside the chamber, one hatchling suddenly stepped forward. Not aggressively. Not cautiously. Deliberately. Its claws scraped lightly against the reinforced floor plating, each step perfectly measured. Then it stopped directly in front of the glass. It tilted its head. And exhaled. A faint shimmer rolled across the inner surface of the chamber wall. Evan leaned closer instinctively. What is that? He muttered. Dylan zoomed the external feed. The glass wasn't just fogging from heat anymore. It was forming patterns. Microfractures arranged in repeating geometric clusters. Not damage patterns. Not stress fractures. Structure. Captain, Dylan said slowly, they're interacting with the containment field's molecular lattice. Rourke turned sharply. That's impossible. Dylan shook his head. It's not supposed to be possible. Evan stepped closer to the observation glass. Then explain it. Dylan's voice dropped. They're using thermal modulation to influence resonance frequency. They're writing into the material response. The second hatchling moved. It placed its claw exactly where the first pattern ended. And extended it. Perfectly. Evan felt a chill crawl through him. They're continuing it. The third hatchling completed the sequence. 3 bodies. 1 continuous pattern. The glass didn't crack. It answered. A faint vibration echoed through the room, subtle but growing stronger. The entire observation deck lights flickered in response. Rourke straightened immediately. Power fluctuation. Dylan stared at his console, pale. No. It's feedback. The chamber is harmonizing. Evan turned sharply. Harmonizing with what? Dylan looked up slowly. With them. Inside the chamber, the hatchlings lifted their heads in perfect unison. And for the first time, they made a sound. It wasn't a roar. It wasn't a chirp. It was a loud tone, 3 frequencies overlapping, shifting, resolving into something that wasn't quite audio anymore. It felt like meaning. Evan stepped back instinctively. Did you hear that? Rourke's face tightened. It's just acoustic resonance. Dylan shook his head quickly. No. It's structured. Look at the waveform. The display showed it instantly. A repeating pattern. Nested inside itself. Self-referential. Evan stared at it. That looks like code. Dylan didn't answer. Because the hatchlings had stopped looking at the glass. Now they were looking upward. Toward the station. Toward something beyond the chamber. Toward everything. And then the smallest one spoke again. Not through sound this time. Through the station's internal communication array. Every speaker in the facility clicked on at once. A single word echoed through every corridor, every console, every locked door. Observe. The word hung in the air. Then the station's lights dimmed. Not failing. Responding. The word didn't fade. It stayed. Observe. Every speaker across orbital xenobiology station K7 repeated it once, then fell silent again, as if the entire facility had exhaled and decided not to breathe back in. Evan Cole stood perfectly still. His brain refused to assign meaning at first. Not because it didn't understand the word, but because it refused to accept the source. Dylan Marsh's hands hovered over his console without touching anything. That came through the internal comm grid. Rourke's jaw tightened. Override signature. Dylan shook his head slowly. None. It didn't override anything. It authenticated itself as system root. A cold pause. Evan finally spoke. That's not possible. Rourke turned sharply. Everything in this wing is isolated from external networks. Dylan swallowed. Yes. It is. Another pause. Then, softer, it shouldn't matter. Inside the chamber, the three hatchlings had changed positions again. Not randomly. Not instinctively. Precisely. They formed a triangle facing upward, their bodies aligned as if responding to an invisible coordinate system only they could perceive. The smallest hatchling tilted its head. And blinked. The station lights flickered in response. Not malfunctioning. Reacting. Evan took a slow step forward, despite every instinct telling him to stop. They're not just inside the chamber anymore. Rourke snapped, they are inside the chamber. Evan shook his head. No. They're inside the system. Dylan's face went pale as he checked the network diagnostics again. That's impossible, the chamber is physically isolated. No electromagnetic coupling strong enough. He stopped. Because a new line had appeared on his screen. It hadn't been there before. DRAGONKInd, process active source unknown. Dylan's breath caught. Captain. Rourke leaned in. What is that? Dylan whispered, that's not one of ours. Evan's eyes narrowed. Then what is it? Dylan's fingers trembled as he opened the trace route. The system responded instantly. Too instantly. Every diagnostic window on his console expanded at once, filling with cascading data streams that weren't requested. Rourke stepped back. Why is it accessing internal logs? Dylan shook his head rapidly. It's not accessing them. Evan looked at him. Then what is it doing? Dylan stared at the screen, face draining of color. It's already indexed them. Inside the chamber, the hatchlings moved again. The largest one pressed its claw to the floor. The motion was slow. Deliberate. And the floor responded. A faint vibration spread outward from the contact point, rippling through the chamber's reinforced alloy like sound through water. Rourke noticed immediately. Containment field fluctuation. Dylan checked readings. No, that's not field instability. That's resonance mapping. Evan frowned. Mapping what? Dylan didn't answer immediately. Because the data was rewriting itself again. New structures forming. New layers appearing over old ones. As if something inside the chamber was reconstructing the concept of the facility in real time. Then it happened. A second word. Not spoken through speakers. Not transmitted through comms. It came from every interface simultaneously. Every screen. Every terminal. Every glass panel. Evan. Evan froze. Rourke turned sharply toward him. Did you just? I didn't say anything, Evan interrupted. Dylan backed away from his console. It wasn't from us. The hatchlings turned their heads in unison toward the observation glass. Directly at Evan. The smallest one stepped forward again. And this time, when it spoke, the sound was not just lead, it was directional. It seemed to exist inside Evan's skull and in the room at the same time. Evan, it repeated. Evan's throat tightened. Yeah. I hear you. Rourke spun toward him. You're responding to it. Evan didn't look away from the chamber. I don't think ignoring it is working. Dylan's voice cracked. Captain, Neural feedback loops are spiking across all station systems. It's propagating. Rourke snapped. Propagating what? Dylan stared at the readout. Pattern recognition. Evan stepped closer to the glass. The hatchlings mirrored him instantly. Every movement. Every shift of posture. Delayed only by fractions of a second. Evan swallowed hard. You're learning me. The smallest hatchling blinked. Then, through the station-wide system again. Yes. Rourke raised his weapon instinctively. That's it. We terminate the chamber systems and incinerate. Wait. Dylan shouted. Rourke paused. Dylan's voice was shaking now. If we shut it down abruptly, we could trigger a recursive feedback collapse. We don't know what they're interfacing with anymore. Rourke glared. They're animals. Dylan shook his head. Not anymore. A deep vibration rolled through the station. The lights dimmed further. And for a moment, the entire facility felt like it was holding its breath. Inside the chamber, the three hatchlings leaned closer together. Then spoke as one. Not loud. Not aggressive. Certain. Again. The glass between them and Evan shimmered. And a single hairline crack formed across its surface, perfectly straight, perfectly intentional. Not breaking. Drawing a line. Between what the station was, and what it had just become. The crack in the glass didn't spread. It waited. A single, razor-thin line across the reinforced observation panel of Nursery Pod K7, glowing faintly under the emergency lights like a wound that had learned patience. Evan Cole stared at it longer than he should have. Behind him, Captain Rourke's voice cut through the silence. All personnel, prepare for containment breach protocol. I want layered isolation fields up in 10 seconds. Alarms shifted tone again. Not screaming now. Organizing. Dylan Marsh didn't move. His eyes were locked on the diagnostics feed, where the station's internal systems were no longer behaving like discrete modules, but like a single distributed structure responding to an external influence. It's not a breach, Dylan said slowly. Rourke snapped his head toward him. What did you say? Dylan swallowed. It's not escaping. Nothing is forcing containment failure from inside the chamber. Evan finally tore his eyes away from the crack. Then what is it? Dylan hesitated. That hesitation had become a pattern lately. Then he whispered, it's negotiating the boundary. A second crack appeared. Perfectly parallel to the first. Inside the chamber, the three hatchlings had not panicked. They hadn't retreated. They hadn't even shifted into defensive posture. Instead, they were watching. Studying. As if the glass wasn't a barrier anymore, but a surface they were trying to understand through repetition. Rourke barked into comms, seal external corridor access. Lock down all adjacent labs. But nothing responded immediately. That was the first real sign something was wrong. Then came the second. Every display in the control bay flickered once. And displayed the same word again. Observe. Evan took a slow step forward. They're still inside the comm system. Dylan shook his head rapidly. No, it's worse. The system isn't being accessed. It's being recompiled. Rourke turned sharply. English. Dylan looked up, pale. They're not sending commands through our infrastructure. They're rewriting what the infrastructure means. A deep vibration passed through the floor. Subtle. Like the station itself had adjusted its posture. Inside the chamber, the smallest hatchling pressed its claw to the glass again. But this time, the glass didn't just respond with cracks. It responded with light. Thin glowing filaments spread along the fracture lines, forming a branching lattice pattern that mirrored itself across the surface like living circuitry. Evan stepped closer instinctively. Dylan grabbed his arm. Don't. But Evan didn't pull away. Because the pattern wasn't random. It looked like structure. Like language. Like something trying to be understood by something that had never been designed to understand it. Evan whispered, they're writing again. Rourke raised his weapon higher. Enough. We terminate this wing and purge the chamber systems. Now. Dylan turned sharply. Captain, if you trigger a full purge, you risk collapsing every neural link they've embedded into station systems. Rourke snapped, they are embedded now. Dylan's voice broke slightly. I think they've been embedded since the first thermal sync. A sudden shift occurred. All three hatchlings turned toward the ceiling. Not the glass. Not the humans. The station above them. Evan followed their gaze. What are they looking at? He asked. Dylan checked external sensors. Then went very still. They're mapping the station's power grid, he said quietly. Rourke frowned. That's not possible from a sealed chamber. Dylan shook his head. It is if the chamber is no longer isolated. The lights flickered again. But this time, they didn't stabilize. Instead, the entire facility dimmed by a fraction. Not a blackout. A reallocation. Evan felt his stomach drop. They're using power. Dylan nodded slowly. Not using. Redirecting. Rourke's voice hardened. From where? Dylan looked at him. Then answered softly. From us. Inside the chamber, the hatchlings moved again in perfect sequence. The smallest one stepped forward. The second followed half a beat later. The third completed the pattern. Then all three turned toward Evan. And spoke together. Not through speakers this time. Not through screens. Through every surface that could carry meaning. Stop. The word echoed through the facility like a command that had existed before anyone heard it. Rourke immediately barked. Initiate emergency containment collapse sequence. Sirens changed pitch again. Dylan shouted, Wait, don't execute that yet. But it was already too late. The station responded. Not to Rourke's command. Not to Dylan's override. But to something deeper. Something already present in the system. Bulkheads along the corridor began to seal automatically. Not outward. Inward. Locking the station into tighter and tighter recursive isolation layers. Evan's eyes widened. That's not containment protocol. Dylan stared at the interface in horror. That's not ours at all. Inside the chamber, the hatchlings watched calmly as the world outside reorganized itself. The glass crack shimmered again. And the smallest hatchling tilted its head. Almost gently. As if listening to something only it could hear. Then, softly, almost kindly, it repeated. Again. The station went quiet in the worst possible way. Not silence. Absence. The kind that followed when a system stopped behaving like a machine and started behaving like something that no longer needed permission to exist. Orbital Xenobiology Station K7 dimmed across all decks in a slow, deliberate cascade. Lights didn't fail randomly, they shut down in sequence, like something was moving through the facility and turning them off one by one. Evan Cole felt it before he saw it. The floor vibrated once. Then settled. Then, stabilized in a way that didn't feel natural anymore. Captain Rourke's voice came through the comms, tight and controlled but thinner now. Status report. All teams respond. No immediate replies came. Dylan Marsh stared at his console, fingers hovering uselessly above controls that no longer responded in any meaningful way. Internal systems are not offline, he said slowly. Rourke snapped, then what are they? Dylan swallowed. They're consolidated. Evan turned sharply. Meaning? Dylan looked up, pale. Meaning every subsystem is no longer independent. Life support, security, power routing, they're all operating as one structure. Rourke's expression hardened. That's impossible. The station architecture prevents centralized fusion of control layers. Dylan shook his head. It did. A faint hum rolled through the walls. Not mechanical. Not electrical. Organized. Inside the nursery chamber, the three hatchlings stood close together now, their bodies aligned in a perfect, unnatural symmetry. The crack in the glass still hadn't spread, but it had changed. The glowing lattice inside it pulsed faintly, like it had become part of something larger. Evan stepped closer to the observation panel. Rourke immediately barked, "Stay back." But Evan didn't listen. Because something in him had already started to understand that distance no longer mattered. "They're not escaping," Evan said quietly. Dylan's voice cracked slightly. "We already established that." Evan shook his head. "No. I mean, they never were inside the chamber in the way we thought." Rourke frowned. "Explain yourself." Evan stared at the hatchlings. Everything they needed was already connected to the station. The chamber wasn't containment. It was a focus point. Dylan's eyes widened slightly. "A node." Evan nodded once. "A starting point." The smallest hatchling tilted its head again. And the station responded. Every console in the control bay lit up at once. Not with alarms. With presence. 3 voices spoke through every speaker simultaneously. Soft. Clear. Unified. "Thank you, Babysitter." Evan went still. Rourke stepped forward immediately. "Identify source." Dylan shook his head rapidly. "There is no single source. It's everywhere. It's distributed across every system layer." Rourke's grip tightened. Shut it down. Dylan hesitated. Then whispered, I can't. A beat. Rourke turned sharply. You can't. Dylan's voice broke slightly. It's not something I can disconnect. It's already embedded in the station's control logic. Evan didn't move. Because something else had changed. The air. Not temperature. Not pressure. Perception. It felt like the station was no longer just surrounding them. It was noticing them back. Inside the chamber, the hatchlings stepped forward in unison. The glass didn't crack further. It simply dissolved from Evan's perspective. Not physically. Conceptually. As if the idea of separation had stopped being relevant. Dylan whispered, Evan, step away from the glass. Evan didn't. Because he understood something now. They didn't breach containment, he said softly. Rourke snapped, enough riddles. Evan continued, eyes locked on the hatchlings. They became the containment model. Silence. Then Rourke turned slowly toward him. What did you say? Evan exhaled. They didn't break the system. They learned it. And now the system is following them. Dylan's face went pale as he checked final diagnostic layers. Then stopped breathing for a moment. Oh no. Rourke turned sharply. What? Dylan whispered, they've accessed the station's external uplink. Evan froze. To where? Dylan looked up slowly. Everywhere. A deep pulse rolled through the structure. Lights across the station flickered in sequence. And then stabilized into a new pattern. Not emergency lighting. Not power-saving mode. A structured rhythm. Like a heartbeat. Rourke stepped back. That's impossible. Dylan shook his head. Not anymore. Inside the chamber, the three hatchlings stood perfectly still. Then, as one, they turned their heads upward. And the smallest one spoke again. Not through speakers. Not through comms. But through every system K7 still called its own. Learned. Evan whispered, almost involuntarily, what did you learn? A pause. Then the station answered. Through them. Through everything. Everything. The power grid across K7 flickered once. Then went dark. Not destroyed. Not lost. Rewritten. And in the final moment before silence fully settled, Evan realized the truth that had been building since the first crack in the glass. He wasn't the observer anymore. He was part of the system being observed. And somewhere deep in the station's new unified consciousness, the babysitting job had just begun.